Hey, folks out there in Facebook world, it is Dr. Holly Lucille here with Healthy Happenings, and I'm so excited about this episode because I have one of my heroes, a man who I would not be anything that I am today without him. He is one of the world's leading authority on science-based natural medicine, and we're going to be talking about his latest book and what it's about, the Toxin Solution. And yes, solution, we're going to set up the problem and understand how pervasive toxins are in our environment, how they are having such a detrimental effect on our health. But the solution, the best thing is what we can do about it. So Dr. Pizzorno, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for the nice introduction, my friend, and a delight to talk with you today.
Yay. It's funny. I'm going to try to find this link again here. 1 second, because I want to see the feed on our Facebook Live so I can engage with all these folks that are asking questions, because I know this is a really hot topic. When I first met you, I have to tell this story to everybody. I was like shaking in my shoes. Folks that are, let me mute here. Questions, because I know this is a really hot topic. When I first met you, I have to tell this story to everybody. I was sorry, I can't find the mute. Folks that are, let me mute here. Questions, because I know this is a really hot topic. When I first met you. All right, sorry about this. We're just getting this. Sorry, I can't find the mute. All right, that's not going to happen today. We're going to just get right to it. So when I first met you, we were down in Anaheim, and I think the story was we were at SIMQA, which stands for Single Malt Quality Assurance, right? And the story as I know it, I hope I get this right, is that the lawyers that were working on DSHEA, the Dietary Health Supplement Education Act, would get together on Sundays, sort of pro bono, and do this work for this wonderful law that was passed over single malt Scotch on Sundays. And so subsequently, when our tribe or our industry met at the different expos around the United States, SIMQA was there. And I remember I was sitting with our good friend, Tori Hudson, and I'm like, oh my gosh, is that Joe Pizzorno? I literally was just like, I was so excited to meet you. And it's been such a blessing. And it's just been one of my biggest career highlights to have you as a friend and to have worked with you in the past decade or so. So I am just really thrilled that you're here. And your book, I want you to tell people, I heard you do a presentation of this back last summer. And you took all of the advance money that you got from publishing this book. And how did you use it?
So first off, thank you for a very kind compliment.
Yes.
And I'm sorry to hear it was stressful for you to meet me, because I love meeting you. Okay. Because I very much admire the work you do, making our medicine more understandable to a lot more people. Because when people understand what we do, it makes so much sense, and yet it seems so mysterious sometimes.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so let's go back to the book and why I wrote it. And I'm kind of curious to see if you've seen the same thing that I have. So when I first started my practice way back in 1975, back in the dark ages, when I was giving people health advice, it was almost all entirely based on the active determinants of health. What I mean by the active determinants of health is based on what they would do. So for them to get better nutrition, eat real food. To have lower level of toxins, well, avoid obvious toxic sources like cigarette smoking and excess alcohol and things like this. So it's all about the active determinants of health. But then I started noticing a change in when people are sick. We moved from the active determinants of health to what I would call the passive determinants of health being dominant now. And when I talk about passive determinants of health, so let's say you follow government guidelines to eat 7 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. Great idea. But if you buy those fruits and vegetables from a conventional grocery store, they're actually depleted of nutrients. Like the copper content of copper has dropped 75% in the last 50 years. So the passive determinant of health, you think you're eating healthy foods, but they're depleted nutrients. But it's even worse than that, and that is another passive determinant of health is our exposure to environmental toxins that's gone up dramatically in the last 50 years. So that food we're looking at that's depleted in trace minerals, well, now it actually has toxins in it. It's got cadmium if it's grown with high phosphate fertilizers.
Right.
If it's something like kale, which we think is so healthy,
Right.
It's super high in neurotoxic organophosphate pesticides. And we start looking at the water supplies, for example. As we've moved from you might say, readily available, relatively uncontaminated water supplies to, as the population has grown, going after less and less desirable water supplies, all these water supplies are contaminated with things like arsenic. 10% of the public water supplies in the U.S. have arsenic levels known to induce disease in humans. They look at our health and beauty aids. We put on our skin to make us look pretty, which sounds good, but they're full of phthalates that bind to the insulin receptor sites on the cells and poison the cells that can't respond to insulin. So anyways, I started seeing this data. I started really seeing it about 10 years ago. It's been around longer than that, but I really started seeing it 10 years ago. And I realized people need to know about this. So I got a really good agent. We talked a publisher into giving us a nice advance. And I spent the whole advance answering the question, what % of each chronic disease is due to specific environmental toxins?
Yeah.
So I got two really bright naturopathic doctors, because they're the ones who understand how to think about this. And we started this systematically going through disease by disease and toxin by toxin to see how much do they contribute to disease. And the numbers we found are simply stunning.
Yeah. That was incredible work to take your advance and hire these researchers and get that data, because the data in the book is amazing. And you're right, I just noticed even in practice that with even good old naturopathic principles, good old naturopathic care, a subset of my population of patients would not get better. And in my mind, I still had to think, where are there obstacles to cure? And this is really in the last 10 to 15 years. What is in the way? What is stopping the body from doing its job and coming back into balance and healing itself? And my gosh, if you do not look at environmental exposure or their environmental sort of history of the clinical case, you're really missing something, because it's just been amazing to me that when we find it and we take care of it, how the body can go ahead and do its thing. But these are very pervasive in our environment right now, right? Pervasive.
It's even scary. What's incredible is I'm not ready to publish this yet, nor to talk about it a lot, because I'm having trouble believing what I'm seeing. But we have a number of situations where we're getting more of the environmental toxin that's poisoning the enzyme system than of the trace mineral necessary for the enzyme system to work properly. So it's not surprising we see this huge increase in disease burden.
Yeah,
yeah. Well, and the great example being diabetes. And that's one that grabbed my attention the first, because it has the most data. So I assume you've been reading the work of Ducky Lee, a researcher out of South Korea. I think she's the first person to really start putting hard numbers behind this. And there she worked on this diabetes. And it makes sense, because when I was in naturopathic medical school half a century ago, diabetes affected like 0.5% of the population. It was really rare. I remember it was like 6 months into my private practice before I saw my first diabetic patient. You might say, well, I started slow practice. No, my practice took off like gangbusters, and within 6 months, I was fully booked. I had a 3-month waiting list, okay? So I was seeing a lot of patients, but there just wasn't much diabetes. And now 15% of the population has diabetes. What happened? Our genetics didn't change.
Right.
And people say, well, we eat a lot more sugar now. Well, actually, our sugar consumption in the last 50 years has actually not gone up very much. Okay.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it is interesting. I'm not saying let me be clear. I'm not saying sugar is good for you, but I'm saying as a cause for diabetes, it's not strong enough. It just doesn't correlate as well. Then I started looking at, well, how about things that make it more difficult for insulin to work? That is, things that block the insulin receptor sites. Could that be a part of the problem? And I started looking at, how about things that damage the pancreas? When we look at it from that perspective, the data is just overwhelming. It's just huge.
Well, and it's interesting because, especially when it comes to diabetes, if you look at the projection of where we're supposed to be as far as numbers of cases in 2050, it's 160% increase. And we have so much information, right, for consumers, how to be healthy, how to get healthy, certainly how to decrease BMI and get to an ideal weight, all things that might contribute to diabetes, but it's still on the rise. And I think we have to ask, why? So as far as toxins and the research that you've done, what do you think are the worst toxins out there, and where do they come from?
Yeah, that of course is the key question. And what's interesting is that as I've looked at more and more research, my answer to that has changed. So, and it turns out that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has its own definition for what are the worst toxins. They put arsenic as number one. Now, I was surprised by that, because when I was doing the corporate wellness program in Canada, where I looked at 4,500 oil field workers, okay, where I looked at, several thousand people, did complete tests on them for nutritional status, toxic status, and such, the tests I was using weren't particularly sensitive to arsenic, so I wasn't aware of it. But since the CDC said arsenic was the worst, I said, okay, fine, I better start looking at arsenic. And I was stunned by what I found. And probably the best example of that is a 20-year, 20,000 person prospective study done in Italy. So I really like prospective studies because you look at measures and say, okay, rather than theoretically what happens, let's actually watch and see what happens.
Right.
So they looked at these people in this province in Italy, where some people had well water that is high in arsenic, and some people had well water that was low in arsenic. Otherwise, they're a pretty homogeneous population. And they followed people for 20 years. And what they found was those in the high arsenic level, by the way, I'm saying high arsenic, it was within what's considered okay, but
right.
they're the ones that had the most arsenic. So
right.
look at these people, they got more stroke and heart disease, and in particular cancer, lots more cancer, more diabetes, etc. Then you look at the threshold by which how much arsenic has to be in the water supply before you start seeing more disease. And the threshold was fairly clear. Then you look at the U.S. population, and 25% of the U.S. population is above the threshold of arsenic known to cause disease. So it's very, very clear. Arsenic is number one.
Wow. And
where does it come from? Okay.
Where's it come
number
from?
one is it comes from water. And just because you're on a public water supply, don't trust that it's safe, because first off, only 50% of the public water supplies even test their water, okay? And most of them don't report it. But if you look at the USGS, U.S. Geological Service, they actually have tested this water. And it turns out 10% of water supplies that have been tested are high in arsenic. But people on private wells must have the arsenic tested, because some wells have a lot of arsenic in them. So it turns out the threshold for increased disease risk is about 10 micrograms of arsenic per liter of water, okay? So there are some water supplies that have 3,000 micrograms of arsenic per liter of water. And when you look at those kinds of water supplies, you see these huge clusters of disease. So arsenic is number one. So it comes from water, where you have the strong disease correlations, but you also see it comes from rice, if it's grown in water that's been contaminated with arsenic. Even at normal levels, the rice will really absorb the arsenic very efficiently. And the third choice is fish, is chicken. Now, up until about 3 years ago, it was legal, according to the USDA, for people to put arsenic into the food supply for chickens in order to pump them up and also to inhibit a parasite formation. Turn this guy off. So anyway, so those are the three big sources: arsenic, water, and chicken, and rice. Now, the good news is that we actually, as humans, are very good at getting rid of arsenic. So you can look at how good we are getting rid of toxins by what the half-life of that toxin is in the body.
Right.
And the half-life for arsenic is only 2 days. So that means that as we evolve as a species, we're exposed to arsenic. So if you stop being exposed to arsenic, you can get rid of it pretty well. Now, there's a small percent of the population whose genetics don't let them get rid of arsenic very well, but that's the minority, not by far the majority of people. So all you have to do, if you're having problems with arsenic, is find the source and get rid of it.
So in general, I want to ask you a question for folks, for the viewers. How would somebody suspect perhaps that they had a heavy metal burden or a environmental toxin burden? What would they expect to feel like? What are some of the common symptoms and signs that folks walk around with probably every day, a little bit off, not knowing sure what's going on? What would you say?
So I actually wrote an editorial on that and gave a lecture on that at the AIHM last fall, and I got a standing ovation, okay, which is nice because it doesn't happen very often, so it's really nice for it to happen.
That's
and
great.
I say when you're trying to practice environmental medicine, and this fits with consumers as well, being aware of environmental toxicity, I kind of break people into three categories. So let's start with the obvious category, and that is people who have known exposure. And when I say known exposure, it turns out you can determine if you're exposed for some very simple things. So first off, you have a mouthful of so-called silver fillings.
Right.
Silver fillings are 55% mercury, and there's a direct correlation between the amount of fillings in your mouth, the amount of mercury in your blood, in your urine, and in your brain. Okay, so if you got silver fillings, you've got mercury toxicity. It may not overtly manifest as an obvious disease, but the reality is it's damaging your physiology. Okay, so exposure. Do you work in a dentist's office? You'd be exposed to mercury. Are you in an area where you're near, for example, major industry? Are you near? Have you actually checked to see are there any glass making companies near you? Because color glass making, because colored glass gets the color from heavy metals, for particularly cadmium, things like this. Are you consuming soy products that are grown with high phosphate fertilizers? Because most high phosphate fertilizers are contaminated with cadmium, and cadmium ends up in the food. So there's a study done here in Seattle where they looked at women with osteoporosis, trying to find what the various causes were. And they determined that 20% of women with osteoporosis have osteoporosis because of cadmium toxicity, and primarily came from consumption of tofu that was from soy that was conventionally grown.
I want to interrupt you just for a second, because isn't it interesting? And I think this is where the devil is in the details when it comes to medicine and the art of medicine, because you've mentioned, kale, you've mentioned chicken and rice, and you've mentioned soy as far. And when you say it really fast, I mean, many of my healthy patients or folks that I know would have a dinner of chicken rice with kale, and it's supposed
to be healthy.
Yeah, it's supposed to be healthy, right? But I think this is where the devil's in the details, and that's why the solution is so important, because, as we've talked about, these metals and these toxins being so pervasive and being in good food sources that we're thinking that are healthy. So as you mentioned with arsenic, the short half-life in our bodies, they do have the ability to get rid of toxins, we've got this great detoxification system. When the burden of the body, though, gets so much, can you talk through what that is like? I mean, is it just stimulate a detox or go to your doctor? What is your suggestion when it comes to, okay, we've identified a problem. We know that probably we all should get tested, or at least assessed for these environmental toxins, and a complete history as far as your environment, what you've been exposed to in the past. And there are some great questions to elicit this. Believe me, there was one patient that I had that it kind of came up because I wasn't asking the right questions at the time, but her family owns dry cleaning. And she grew up bare feet playing on these, they had 7 different stores in the area. And that just tipped me off. And then we went and running down that area. And I was so glad that it came up, but it also made me a better practitioner as far as eliciting that information. But back to a detox, what do you suggest?
So let me back up a little in the questions you asked, and go back a bit to when people should be aware that they're being toxic and what to do about it. And I would say that anybody who's chronically unwell and anybody who has any major chronic disease must look at the components of toxins and how that contributes to it. And I probably have a skewed background because I come from a relatively long-lived family, and I did not see much disease in my family. So I'm kind of used to, when you grow older, you don't have more disease. You just grow older and eventually you die. But what we're happening is people get older, they get more and more disease. And a key reason for that is that when environmental toxins are causing damage, it takes time to show up. And in general, we're looking at the research, we compare people to top level exposure, people to bottom level exposure, and try to figure out how much disease they have. The correlations don't show up until people about the age of 40. Up until about the age of 40, very little disease toxin correlations. After the age of 40, now all hell breaks loose because multiple things have happened. First off, the body level continues to increase because while some things like arsenic we're good at getting rid of, these things called persistent organic pollutants. These are man-made, and I'll say man and women-made new to nature chemicals.
People-made chemicals.
That were designed to be difficult to break down, and they have half-lives measured in months to years. And PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, even though they were banned 40 years ago, they accumulate in things like farmed fish. And the half-life of these things is like 10 years. But once they get in your body, they're almost impossible to get rid of. So that's what I look at. People, any kind of chronic disease, any kind of low-level vitality, feeling sick all the time for no good reason, you've got to look at toxins. So then what do you do about it? Number one, of course, is stop exposure. And stopping exposure means only inorganically grown foods, making sure your water's pure, use a water purifier if necessary. If you're living in a city or within 100 yards of a major road, you've got to have air filters in your house because all the particulate matter coming particularly from diesels is really, really toxic. Health and beauty aids, there are a lot of good health and beauty aids that don't have phthalates in them. Use low phthalate health and beauty aids. All these things to avoid exposure. Because once they're in the body, there's so many are so hard to get rid of.
Yeah.
And then to get rid of them, realize our bodies have these great detox systems to help them out. So a detox system would be something like increasing the amount of fiber in your diet, because when the liver's trying to get rid of this stuff, it dumps it into the gut, and if there's not enough fiber in the gut, it comes back to the body through something called intrahepatic recirculation. Okay, so more fiber, less toxins. We can also facilitate the body's mechanism for breaking down the chemicals, and the most important of them is something called glutathione, which I'm sure you're well aware of. And it's hard to overstate the importance of glutathione in detoxification. And there's two good ways to increase glutathione. One is by taking a supplement called N-acetylcysteine, or NAC for short. And the other is, if you don't want to take a supplement, when wanting to eat a food instead, if you eat whey powder. Whey powder is very high in something called cysteine that promotes the production of glutathione. So we can do that to help the body's own detox systems. And finally, these age-old naturopathic therapies of saunas and fasting, things like this, they work really well. I mean, let's be clear, these old therapies work just fine.
Yeah, getting things out, open the emunctories,
get it out.
Things out.
Emunctories,
so
yes.
There's a question I would have for you on the chat. If the water supply is contaminated with arsenic, will fruit and vegetables absorb the arsenic?
To some degrees, yes, but the rice is by far the worst.
Okay.
For the absorption of the arsenic.
All right. So I love what you said about avoiding exposure first. You know, a resource that I give to folks all the time is EWG.org or environmentalworkinggroup.org. They're just a great nonprofit organization, and the Clean 15, the Dirty Dozen, the cosmetic database, you can learn a lot. Consumers can learn a lot. I give it to my patients all the time to help in that area. You know, buying organic, of course. And what do you think about the myth, I think, that's out there that organic products are more expensive?
Well, it's true they are more expensive. Okay, then you have to decide, well, do you want to spend your money on your food? Do you want to spend your money on doctors? How long do you want to live? How healthy do you want to be? How smart do you want your children to be? I'm starting my lectures now with how should I say this? A very obnoxious comment. Okay, and I know it's really obnoxious, but I'm trying to grab people's attention. So, for example, I say to people, how many of you been told by your family and friends that you're stupid for wasting money on buying organically grown foods? And almost anybody in the audience can raise their hand because they come to listen to me talk about toxins. Okay, well, that's fine. I say, well, there have now been multiple research studies that show that children born to women with the highest levels of organophosphate pesticides compared to children born to women with the lowest level, they have a 7-point drop in IQ. It's been proven by 3 studies now, and they iron out all the socioeconomic differences. So they're trying to say just how much does the effect of the organophosphate pesticides cause, and it turns out organophosphate pesticides are neurotoxins. When the baby is developing in utero, it damages how the brain develops, and you don't have as high an IQ. So I look at people and say, not only are you smarter for eating organically grown foods, but your children are smarter as well. Okay, so yes, it's more expensive. Make your choices.
Yeah, make your choices. And the way that I think about it, I've had this analogy that I've used for many, many years. It's like, are you wealthy? Where's your health savings account? What's your bank account look like? And I look at it, and most people that present to my office are in debt, let's say, with their health, right? And when I'm thinking about, okay, they're in debt, I'm thinking, well, look, how do you get out of debt? You make more deposits than withdrawals over time. And then we go ahead and identify what those deposits are, and also what those withdrawals, and there's always going to be automatic withdrawals, et cetera. But especially when you're dealing with a long-term chronic disease or multifactorial sort of things and fatigue and persistent weight gain and all of those things, over time, I think buying organic, eating organic is a deposit. You know what I'm saying? When you're looking at your health savings account. And that's where I think I come with the myth, because I'm like, are they really more expensive when you look at the totality of your being wealthy and being able to have the benefits of decreasing your exposure to these things that, in their book, the environmental toxins contribute to autoimmune diseases, thyroid disease, these sort of pop things that we're dealing with and seeing all the time. I think it's a major contributing factor.
Yes, virtually every disease we've looked at is increased by one or more toxins. And we look at something like diabetes, which is so rampant right now. We think that 90% of the diabetes is due to environmental toxins. And this is such a strong correlation that the researchers are calling these things diabetogens and obesogens because they induce obesity as well as diabetes. And let's go back to diabetes and obesity. Most people say, okay, well, people have diabetes now because of all the obesity. And it's clear that people who are obese have way more diabetes. But if you look at Dr. Lee's work, the obese people in the bottom 10% of environmental toxin exposure have no increased risk of diabetes. So it's not the fat that's doing it, it's how they got the fat and what's in the fat that's causing the diabetes.
So, the book, your book is an 8-week program to detox your life, the Toxin Solution. It's definitely written. It's so well written. There's so much data here. For consumers, what is your feeling out there, knowing that you do lecture to practitioners quite a bit? How many doctors really know about the impact of environmental toxins on the things that they're seeing in their practice each and every day?
Good question, and clearly that number is changing. When I first started giving some really good data on environmental toxicity, I think my first really solid lecture in this area was only 5 years ago. And you give your lecture and people come up and ask questions afterwards. Right. So the first question that came up was the medical doctor in the audience, unfortunately, who my dad knows, I know what his name was. He started by saying, that's the most depressing lecture I've ever heard. Because I was showing all the data. So I would say there's more and more doctors becoming aware of this and realize that they need to know this body of knowledge. So that's one reason why, in addition to the Toxin Solution that I wrote, Walter Crinian and I have just completed a textbook called Clinical Environmental Medicine, and that will be out in July. And that'll give doctors a really comprehensive educational and resource option for understanding this body of knowledge.
Great resource. That's going to be a great resource. Walter, Dr. Crinian was our first guest on our very first Healthy Happening. So we're happy to have him. Yeah. Great. That's amazing. Well, there you have it, folks. Listen, the Toxin Solution, an incredible book, complete 8-week, just revamp of what you can do if you have suspected that you've been exposed to environmental toxins. And if you read the book, you're going to probably know that, of course, that probably has happened. Also, number one, reduce exposure as much as you can. And if in doubt, check it out. Go see a naturopathic doctor. Go see a functional medicine practitioner who has the ability to test different tissues based on your clinical presentation, based on your history, based on that great information that you share in that partnership with that doctor. And thank you so much, Dr. Pizzorno, for all the work that you do, saving this planet, saving just so many people's lives, and encouraging science-based natural medicine. I really appreciate it.
Well, and same back at you. Thank you for all you do to advance this body of knowledge. One of the reasons I've worked so hard in this advancing natural medicine is because there's all this unnecessary suffering going on in the world because what you and I have taught is not understood and recognized as well as it should be.
I agree, and it's when you think one of my taglines, and I basically had it done because I thought, hey, I need a tagline. It's like, I would be sitting with my patients and they give me all this information. I sort of just push my chair back. I'm like, let's think this through. I think truly when you just remember what you learned in medical school, and I'm talking about the body and how the physiology works and how the endocrine system is connected and how just what we know from a factual evidence perspective about the body, and then how nutrients, and you even said from a diet, diet, when you look at diet in the dictionary, it's so important, right? It means habitual nourishment. It's how we fuel our biochemistry. If anybody takes a biochemistry class, it's really about nutrition because every single, sort of process that we have in our body is fueled by those cofactors, vitamins and minerals. But now we're looking at things that are perhaps contaminated. But if you think these things through, it's not anything that we're doing that's extraordinary or certainly not, kind of woo-woo. It's really, truly using our minds and applying what we know and wanting that solution and getting people to feel better and saving them from debilitating chronic diseases and polypharmacy, as they grow older, in my opinion. Absolutely.
It's just foundational. How can you expect your body to work if the nutrients aren't there that it needs and it's being poisoned by chemicals and metals? Why would you be surprised that you're sick? Get the nutrients in, get the toxins out. Very straightforward.
We have solutions. All right, folks, thanks so much for spending part of your life with us here on Healthy Happenings. And until next time.